You're listening to A Mighty Fortress, celebrating 500 years of Lutheranism.
A mighty fortress it is our God, a trusty shield and weapon.
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I'm your host, Knight Jake, and welcome to our final edition of Cloning What If? We finally come to part 7 of our 7-part series. Having answered our 4 foundational questions and having looked at the implications of cloning for the church, today we're going to look at cloning and its implications for society. So, again, just to preface each episode, I'm going to be talking about medical themes and stuff like that are probably not appropriate for kids. So if you're parents, don't let your kids listen to this episode, or listen to it yourself and then you can decide whether you think the episode is appropriate enough and if your kids are mature enough to listen to this episode. Also, if anybody has any comments they'd like to make regarding this series, give any feedback, or give any comments or opinions or thoughts towards some of the questions that I have asked, especially on last week's episode when I looked at the implications of cloning for the church. If anybody had any further thoughts to that topic, you can email us at amightyfortresspodcast@yahoo.com.au. So, last week I set out the 4 foundational questions I have, which are: clones are unique individual humans, clones are born with original sin, clones bear the image of God, clones possess their own individual soul. There are 4 foundational questions that will help us to understand clones and will help us to answer the questions in regards to what implications cloning has for church and society. For today's topic, going through the socio-political aspects and implications of cloning, I want to add a 5th foundational statement, which is this: clones, despite their process of procreation, are ordinary human beings, made in the image of God. Clones bear all the rights and responsibilities of any other human being. Clones are ordinary and equal Homo sapiens, should not be treated like a subhuman Homo replica race. Basically, we should not treat them as any less human than the rest of us. Religious thinkers, virtually without exception, assert that if humans were ever clones, the resulting person would have the same inherent value, dignity, and moral status common to all humanity and should be vested with the same civil rights and protection. As I said on last episode, despite the process of procreation in which clones came into this world, they are still ordinary human beings. And like the rest of us, they're made in the image of God, they have a soul, they have original sin, and they have the same rights and responsibilities as the rest of us. Some may wonder about the word Homo replica that I used. That was a word I came up with as just as I said, clones are not a subhuman Homo replica race. Homo replica was just a term I came up with regarding, if we were to treat them as a subhuman race. They're not a subhuman race, they're not Homo replicas, they're Homo sapiens like the rest of us. But that term I just invented as a kind of to draw a distinction between natural born and clone born. Which I do realise sounds a little bit ironic because I'm trying to teach that we shouldn't make a distinction between natural born and clonal born humans. However, there is a distinction that needs to be made. However, in regards to their rights and responsibilities, they should be treated as ordinary human beings and should not be treated as tools or subhuman citizens. So, when and if cloning becomes commonplace and clones begin to live among us and work among us and live next to us, there are a number of questions that society and the church as a part of society will have to face. So, on this episode, in which I'll be going through the socio-political aspects of cloning and the implications cloning has on society, I'm going to be looking at 10 questions. And again, I'm going to be doing my best to provide answers to these questions. These 10 questions are questions that I think society must ask if we are to consider cloning human beings. The first question is, Does cloning destroy the natural traditional family? The answer is yes. Cloning will indeed affect the traditional family structure: mum, dad, children. If the donor and clone live in the same family, there will be a confusion in the family structure between the donor and the clone father, son, brother, twin. The relationship seems very confusing. Clone beings will have multiple parents: the egg donor, the nucleus donor, the womb mother, the parents who raised them. Cloning will also separate human reproduction from the marital relationship. Also, in addition to separating human reproduction from the marital relationship, cloning will actually also separate human reproduction from sexual intercourse, in the same way that so does IVF and any other form of artificial procreation. However, cloning won't separate reproduction from sexual intercourse and relationships any more than any other type of artificial reproduction. And also, cloning won't damage the family structure any more than other things such as homosexual marriage, homosexual adoption, divorce, single parents, and that already destroy the traditional family structure. Cloning is simply one more card to add to the pile of things that are interfering with the traditional God-given family structure of mum, dad, and children. So the second question I'd like to ask is, will cloning have a psychological effect on the clone? The answer is undoubtedly yes. Cloning will have a huge effect on the psychological well-being of a clone. Cloning will create serious issues for identity and individuality, and the family identity will be confused and mixed up. As mentioned above, if a clone lives with their donor, then there'll be a confusion under what relationship there is between the clone and donor, because the clone donor is a twin, yet also your parent. It's a very mixed up way of thinking, and the psychological burdens of knowing that you are a clone will further outweigh any benefits that cloning could ever provide us with. So again, cloning is it's bad for the psychology of a clone. The next question is, will clones face social discrimination? And if so, will this affect the church? And what should the church do in response to this? Well, after identity and relationship crisis, the biggest struggle for clones will be social discrimination. Knowing that someone is a clone rather than a natural-born human being will create a new class distinction and a new form of discrimination. Clonism or clonophobia will be some new form of discrimination, and too soon the social justice warriors will jump all over that. And the church should speak out against such treatment towards clones. We should speak out about treating clones as subhuman homo replicas instead of homo sapiens made in the image of God and worthy of respect. So the church should defend these people. We should speak out. We shouldn't discriminate against clones simply because of the way they were born. However, if this does happen, there's going to be a tendency for the social justice warriors, those pro-LGBTs, the feminists, and all these people are going to jump all over it, and they're going to jump upon bigoted clonism or clonophobia as their new crusade, and they'll villainize the church for being clonophobic and stuff like that. Therefore, I think it's important for the church to get on the front foot and actually establish some clear positions on cloning now. See, if the churches choose to oppose cloning, which I think we should, that will be seen as a form of discrimination in this new social justice clone world. The church will face socio-political pressure to change and to support cloning and to promote cloning and all this other stuff that the social justice warriors will push at us. So not only do I think the church should not only not endorse cloning, but we should oppose it. I think it is important for us to get out on the front foot and make clear doctrinal statements on cloning now before cloning is a big issue. Because if we wait till later, it's going to be much harder to try and sort out all these issues with the social, political pressures pushing on the church. I mean, we already have in the church these days people who are pushing for homosexuality in the church, and for the church to support gay marriage, and for the church to support abortion, and for the church to accept women pastors. We have this social pressure to change, and we need to make sure that we have clear doctrinal statements in place before that pressure comes upon us. So we should get out there ahead of this controversy and make statements concerning cloning before society tries to force the church to respond how society wants us to act. So the fourth question I have is, who's going to be responsible for the well-being of the clone? And this, I think, is a very important question that everybody needs to stop and think about before we even start considering human reproduction of clones. Bayer, in his article An Absence of Love, asks, who will be responsible for raising the child clone? Who will pay for the medical and other expenses? Will their donor be their legal guardian, or the donor's parents, or the government, or some laboratory or biotech company? Who is responsible for this clone? See, human clones will produce a radical shift in the structure of society that has not been experienced beforehand. There will be children who have one biological parent. Human clones will bring brand new issues for social, political, and legal structures that can only truly be answered by the governmental system that oversees those systems. Now, our next question, and this one would be a popular one to answer, is fifth, can clones be used to replace those who have died? Now the answer is no. Yet strangely enough, this question commonly arises from trying to revive heroes of the past like Mozart or Luther, or people trying to revive a deceased parent, spouse, or child. The idea of bringing back somebody from the dead through cloning is a commonly thought of idea, but the idea is ridiculous. A clone derived from a dead child or parent would not in any way restore the deceased person. They may bear the same DNA or genotype, but the mind and personality, phenotype, will be completely different. The genes will be the same, but the memories and thought patterns will be completely different. Also, just imagine for a moment what kind of psychological pressure this will put on a clone, knowing that they were merely cloned as a replacement for somebody else. Imagine a family in which a child had died, whether it be by stillbirth or miscarriage or even later after the child had been born. And the family's solution was to have another child to replace the one they had lost. Now imagine that you were that replacement child. How would you feel knowing the only reason you were born was to be a replacement for your dead sibling? No human wants to be the replacement, and no human is truly replaceable. Now imagine that if that was cloning, that the only reason you were ever cloned was simply because somebody else had passed away and their desire was to bring them back through you. The desire to clone people to replace lost loved ones will only cause the clone grief and suffering. They'll have to live with the constant reminder that their existence is nothing more than the replacement of another person. Each clone is a unique human with their own individual personhood, and they should be treated as such. They should not be treated as simply the replacement for somebody else. I don't think we should even be allowing this. If you're going to clone somebody purely to replace somebody that's died, it's not going to work, because that clone will be completely different to the person who died. All you're going to be doing to the clone is giving them psychological grief and suffering. So now we come to our sixth question. And this is one that I asked last week, and as I said, I was very interested to see if anybody could contact me and give me their opinion on this. But the question I want to ask is, should clones be allowed to get married? And should the church bless or oppose clonal marriage? See, these are two very important questions. Is not only should the church bless or oppose it, but should the government even allow it? See, this question is not a simple one to answer. See, at face value you may say yes, as long as they're a man and a woman, doesn't matter if they're clone or natural born. However, the issue with clonal marriage, and more with clonal people mating in general, is to do with the fact that clones are born with defects and deformities due to their clonehood, which could be passed on to further generations. In fact, there is an almost certainty that any child born of clones will suffer great defects and deformities. Interbreeding of clones will affect the genetic diversity and structure of the human genome. The genetic structure of the human requires a composition of genes from two separate donors. In this way, nature overcomes some of the inherent weaknesses in either donor. Every human being possesses harmful mutations. Cloning will only keep these mutations within the circulation, as they are only being produced from one genome. Widespread cloning and clonal breeding will lead to a decrease in the genetic quality of humanity. And speaking from a genetical, biological point of view, interclonal or intraclonal, so that's either clone to human or clone to clone breeding, should be avoided if not forbidden. So the government probably should put some prohibitions on allowing clones to breed if we ever start allowing humans to be cloned. And thus, what is the church's role then in all of this? See, the church condemns sexual relationships outside of marriage and praises intercourse within marriage. Therefore, the only way the church can ever talk about clonal breeding is if we talk about it in regards to clonal marriage. The church could not condone clonal breeding outside of marriage, and the church could hardly suggest that clonal marriage is okay as long as childbearing does not occur. It would be ridiculous to try and say that, oh, get married, but just don't sleep with each other. Thus, I leave the reader with this open question. I leave the reader of the article and the listener of this podcast with this question: should the church bless or oppose clonal marriage? See, many theologians have suggested that the reason incest was allowed in Genesis but later condemned in Leviticus is because the human genetic structure has gradually declined after the fall, and early on the genes could support such close family relations. But as the genes degraded due to human sin and due to the decline of the fall, the human genome could no longer support incest, and thus God introduced a new law forbidding incest in order to protect the human genetic structure. This is the first use of the law, that God gave us this law as for our own protection, as a barrier. And so the church, because scripture has says that incest is wrong, the church needs to ask the question that if the genetic structure of cloning is so going to mess up the genetic structure of children born, does the church have the right or the responsibility to introduce a new law forbidding sexual relationship with a clone? Now, I don't know, and I'm leaving this as an open question, and I would encourage people to email the show and give me your own feedback on this question. Do you think the church should bless or oppose clone marriage? Do you think clones should have the right to breed with humans or other clones, or should clones be prohibited in breeding? I'd like to know your opinions on this matter, so feel free to email us at amightyfortresspodcast@yahoo.com.au and give me your opinions on clones and clonal marriage and clonal breeding. 7. Should clones be used as objects? Is it okay to clone people for organs, aka harvest clones, or to use clones as slaves, soldiers, or prostitutes? No. Clones are not subhuman beings, and we shouldn't treat them as such. Clones are not someone's property or someone's slave, not even to their donor. They are a human being with the same rights and responsibilities of any other human, and they should be treated as such. However, this idea of using clones either as harvest clones or as slaves or soldiers or even prostitutes is actually a common idea among those who are proponents of cloning. See, in the 2005 film, The Island, the rich clone themselves. They keep these clones healthy and raise them to eventually be killed and cut up for organs for the rich donors. These clones are just harvest clones. They're born only to be used to get organs. And this may seem like science fiction, but a repeated defense in favor of cloning from the proponents of cloning is that we could use clones to provide organs for their donors, and that the body's antibodies would regard the organ as its own and not reject it. And while it is true, we merely assume that a clone would be willing to donate their organs. While clones would make excellent sources of organs, except for the fact that the organ would suffer genetic corruption, We cannot simply just create harvest clones. Harvest clones will most likely be treated as nothing more than an object. We cannot do this. We cannot simply treat clones as objects and not people. We cannot create clones and expect to just take their organs from them. Not only is this just absolutely just wrong and removes all rights and dignities from the clone, but imagine the psychological burdens of knowing that you were only created so that your organs could be harvested. Imagine if a human being was born simply so that they could be cut up to provide organs for somebody else. That removes all human dignity and strips the person of their rights. And in addition to not creating clones for harvesting, we shouldn't create clones as either sex clones, soldier clones, or slave clones. Bayer in his book states that cloning creates an opportunity to produce a new subhuman population of soldiers, slaves, or prostitutes. And Lester and Heffley in their book declare that such things might seem to be science fiction, but already people have suggested cloning the top soldiers to create armies of elite soldiers. If the church truly believes that clones are normal human beings made in the image of God, then we have to speak out against such inhuman and subhuman treatment of clones. Which leads me to question 8. Should clones be experimented on? In addition to not treating clones like objects, slaves, soldiers, or prostitutes, we should not treat clones like lab rats. The first few human clones will inevitably be subjected to a range of scientific studies and experiments, which will lessen over time as cloning becomes more common, but it will still happen. See, during World War II, Nazi Germany, Japan, and America used forced human guinea pigs to help foster the war effort. In the name of scientific progress, many humans were subjected to inhuman conditions. And if human reproductive cloning takes place, undoubtedly many humans will be subjected to subhuman treatment and seen as nothing more than lab rats. If human reproductive cloning occurs, then the church will assuredly have to speak out against such inhuman, subhuman treatment. This brings me to question 9, which is actually one that affects us today. If we agree that it's inhuman to treat clones like lab rats, then what about the inhuman treatment of cloned embryos? If we take seriously our pro-life slogan that life starts at conception, then the human life in all stages of life is intrinsic of God-given value, worth, and dignity, and that the embryo bears the image of God, then why then do we allow the continued use of therapeutic cloning and embryonic stem cell research? See, unlike these hypothetical situations that I've talked about reproductive human cloning, in the future, therapeutic cloning and experimentation on human embryos is a present-day reality. And if we are concerned with not experimenting on humans, then why are we allowing experimentation to happen on embryos? If that embryo is truly a human life like we believe, then why are we allowing such inhuman treatment to be done to an unborn human? So each clone, whether they're an embryo or an adult, is a human being. And every embryo bears the life and soul of the clone. See, if Dolly took 277 tries to produce a single cloned sheep, consider how many tries it will take to produce a human clone. See, even if we manage to produce a human clone on the 100th try, then that's still 99 lives that have perished. And this is not even mentioning the wanton destruction of embryos that takes place in therapeutic cloning and stem cell research. With reproductive cloning, the embryo is placed inside a womb with the hope of going full term and producing an offspring. But with therapeutic cloning, which I'll remind you is legal in over 15 countries that have outlawed reproductive cloning, the embryo will be allowed to grow in the petri dish for up to 14 days. The embryo will then be either experimented on, or in the case of stem cell research, the stem cells will be removed from it, or used to grow cloned organs. In doing so, the embryo, which bears the life and soul of a clone, is destroyed. The embryos are created purely for destruction. See, one major issue with human cloning is the destruction of clonal life in the experimentation, and such wanton destruction of unborn human lives should be opposed. The embryo should be protected from the point of conception. Thus, the Church should object to any form of embryonic research as it discards, destroys, and experiments on humans' lives at the most vulnerable stage of human life. So this is not simply a question for the future, this is a question for now. This is something the Church needs to do right now. We need to step in and we need to prevent therapeutic cloning and stem cell research on embryos. We now come to my 10th and final question. What rights do the dead possess in regards to not being cloned? So I wish to end this section on social political implications with a question concerning the dignity of the dead. See, many people have aspirations of cloning the heroes of the past. However, what about the respect and dignity of the dead person? Should not the dead be left alone in peace? Whose consent is needed in order to produce a clone? Will the DNA donor consent be enough? Or does the DNA donor need to have consent from the egg donor? Does there need to be continued consent? Or does there need to be a specific number of potential clones that could be consented to? See, these are all serious questions that need to be taken into consideration. See, my solution is that in order for a human clone to be produced, there needs to be full consent from both DNA and egg donor, and there needs to be continued consent for every clone that is born. In this way, donors retain full right over their bodies, eggs, and DNA. As for the deceased persons, I believe that regulations will need to be made in order to defend their dignity. My suggestion is that just as people must legally declare themselves an organ donor or donate their body to science prior to their death, so too people will have to make a legal declaration making themselves a clone donor prior to their death. In addition to this, the donor will need to organise some procedures and regulations concerning the number of clones that may be produced, either by providing a limitation on the number of clones that can be produced from their DNA, or by naming a clonal executive of their will who will be responsible for the donor's DNA after their death and who can give consent on their behalf. So basically we come now to the end of my article and the end of this whole discussion. If you would like to read my article, you can find it on my website, The Order of Knight George, you can find it under the URL of www.clam.info, that's www.clam.info. There, if you go to the articles tab, you can find Jake Zabel, and you can click on that and you'll be able to find my article, Cloning What If, in which you can have a read of this entire article. I'd like to just wrap up by just reading the conclusion from my article, which says thus: while reproductive cloning is currently outlawed in many countries, including Australia, legislation is always subject to change. If the laws change and cloning becomes a common practice, there is a likelihood that clones will become an integrated part of society. In this hypothetical future, clones will become commonplace in our cities and in our churches. If such a circumstance arises, the Church and the wider society will be faced with a number of issues that will need to be addressed. Thus, I am urging the Church to make a start and begin to put some precautions now while cloning seems far off. In doing so, the Church needs to retain 4 foundational points. Clones are unique individual human beings with the same rights and responsibilities as the rest of us. They have original sin. They bear the image of God, and each clone possesses their own individual soul. Thank you for listening to this episode of Mighty Fortress and for listening to this series on cloning What If. I've been your host, Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.